Dr. Tan, it's so good to see you. I'm so glad that you're talking with me today and that my students get to be introduced to you. Yes, yes. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Oh my gosh, Dr. Nelson. Maybe I'll just start off by saying that I was once your adjunct professor.
It's true. It's true. Let me just say, like, on top of that, Dr. Tan was my 4th-year clinical mentor, and oh my gosh, has been just a dear, dear friend and mentor ever since, and was the exact person that I needed my 4th year. And I like reference, I reference my time with Dr. Tan every time I'm in clinical team. I'm like, well, my 4th-year mentor, we did this with my 4th-year mentor. Maybe it would be helpful for you.
Hilarious. Oh my gosh.
I am so just thankful and blessed to have you in my life. And you have so much wisdom, and Kanye's hacking up in the background, sorry. So much wisdom and just so much experience. And Dr. Tan works at the Portland DBT clinic, so you'll get to hear from her both in theories as well as here in essentials. Just such a wealth of knowledge, and such a dear, dear person to me, friend, mentor, colleague, and I'm just grateful for you.
Oh my gosh, Dr. Nelson, please call me Erica.
Yes.
So I'm just really glad to be here, and it's been fabulous. Like, I think this is what every mentor wishes for, right? Like, this moment where somebody you've mentored has like gotten to the same place as you, and it's like, okay, now we're peers.
Yeah.
Right. I know that happened for me when I was at school at Regent University out on the East Coast. Like, becoming peers with the people I looked up to was just like, oh my gosh, like, here we are. And it's fabulous. So
yeah,
I really love that. It's kind of like what we're talking about today with respect to intersectionality.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it actually just reminded me of that too. Like, even just context, right? Like, not only that professional change, right? The shift in our identities, right? And from a professional sense, but even region wise, right? You just said that you went to school on the East Coast, and I know that, like, you're not from the East Coast, right? So, like, there's all of these different parts of us that not only inform our identity in this moment, but it continue to shift and change too, right? Like, our identity and sense of self and understanding of ourself is not static, and it continues to shift and change and morph if we let it, right? Especially if we let it. It can also be really easy to try to keep ourselves the same, right? Despite the way that life and the world is changing around us, trying to be really rigid around our sense of understanding ourselves. And I think that it causes problems, right?
Absolutely. Well, what you're talking about in DBT, we reference as transactions, right? So identity is transactional in the sense that, you know, how I interact with you affects how you interact with me. And so just depending on different circumstances, it may be that, you know, certain people may find certain aspects of their identities or their you know, I say identities because there's so many facets of us. Like, we're not just like a carton of milk.
Right.
We're more like Starbucks drinks that have those multiple boxes. And it's like, how many of those boxes do I check off?
Yeah.
And I think probably more than we think about. So it may be that in certain contexts, like at home, my Chinese identity gets a little bit more reinforcement than maybe my Canadian identity. Certainly, you know, with my friends who are like queer, my queer identity gets reinforced. And in certain situations, like when I was in grad school at Regent University, my Christian identity was what got highlighted.
Right.
So I think it's super helpful for us to be mindful to all these different aspects of ourselves to see, like, how are they interacting?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, you were talking about the transactional piece that we were just talking about interpersonal therapy in theory this week, and they talk a lot about that too. That we kind of have this filter, and it shifts. The same thing can be interpreted differently depending on who it is, what the context is, right, and how that's different depending on who you're with. And I think about it even from a Gestalt perspective, like that foreground background, right? That we have this kind of ebb and flow and moving, that we always have these parts of our identities, but depending on the context or the folks that we're around, there might be a different piece of us that's more at the foreground or at the background.
For
And
sure.
I even think that, like, again, as we move and grow throughout our life, that our understanding of different parts of our identity shifts and changes, right? So for me, as a Black woman growing up in Oregon, right? Growing up in rural Oregon and being like literally the only person of any color in my entire school, pre-K through 12, and then graduate until my brother came, of course, then there was two. And then graduating and coming to George Fox in Newberg, Oregon, which felt like a big city to this little rural town girl, which clearly it's not. It's not a big city, but it had proximity. It had proximity to Portland, you know, because where I grew up, it took an hour and a half to get to the nearest like mall, or it took 5.5 hours to get to Portland to get things for my hair. Or we'd have to go down and drive 5 hours towards Sacramento so that I could get things for my hair. And so being in Newberg, while Newberg itself wasn't a big city, like it had that proximity to Portland, it felt like a huge shift and big city. But then being at George Fox, and my freshman year, I was one of 5 Black students on campus. Now there were other students of colors. There was a good there was a good Asian population, a lot of international students. There were a few Hispanic students, not very many. So there was more diversity than I was used to, but clearly not a lot. And so understanding myself in that perspective, having always been the only one, while it was a big part of my identity was as a woman of color, but it was always filtered through white lens. Like my understanding of myself as a Black woman was through a white lens. How I was to act, how I was supposed to talk, how I was supposed to dress, how I was to present myself in every situation was always filtered through a white lens. And then I didn't understand, and that didn't shift for me until I was then in a new context, right? And then I moved to the East Coast and was in Boston, which was much more diverse, though they don't think that it's diverse, right? It's pretty segregated. It's not as diverse as other places, but for me, I was like, you don't understand what not diverse is. Like, you don't understand what not having access to other people's really look like. And then I lived in Baltimore, right? And then Baltimore being the first time where I was in a city. Baltimore, right? You got Balmer or you got Baltimore.
Baltimore.
And there, it's the first time it's a city of 60% Black individuals.
Yeah.
And it was the first time that, like, sitting in and feeling not a tension around my identity as a Black woman, like not about my identity specifically about being a Black woman, but all of a sudden these tensions of like, why did I do that? Where did that come from? And recognizing that there were so many things that I did on a day-to-day basis, even the timbre of my voice, like my actual voice, I didn't even realize that my voice was different. I wasn't even talking in my real voice before. And that even that had shifted the way I held myself, the fact that I wouldn't let myself go out wearing a head wrap, that I had these things that were so internalized based on the context that I had been in. And now I've experienced a different context where I'm not the only one. And so my understanding of my Black identity, that specific part of my identity, totally shifted, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It gets highlighted. And then I think in a way, I don't know if this is the case for you, but when I grew up Christian, like growing up Christian, like being gay, being a lesbian was like, no, no. Right. And so similarly, it wasn't until I was immersed in like a group of lesbians who I met through CrossFit
Right.
and other stuff in softball. Like I never played softball, but they played softball. So it's like softball by proxy.
Yeah.
Just to clear up the stereotype, not every lesbian plays softball.
I was like, it's very stereotypical of you, Erica.
But it wasn't until I was in that context, I was like, ow, wait, there are these parts of me that I had been afraid to be in contact with.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was like, no, I don't have to be afraid anymore. And just having proximity to other people who had shared experiences, I think helped me to be more comfortable in that aspect of myself. And that then created other opportunities for that interaction and intersection and transaction with other parts of my identity.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think that happens. I think that happens in lots of different parts of our identity, right? And even so, for me, again, as a Black woman, like of my Black identity, I think that was a part that tension that I'm talking about really was that contact. Like, wow, there was these parts of me that I was afraid to express. I was afraid to have a full expression because of my context, right? I just didn't allow myself to be free in that space. And I even think, as another identity marker as a professional too, right?
Oh, completely.
Right? That, I look at the way that I am now professionally and recognize that it looks different than other people too, right? That coming to that space of being able to say, you know what, I actually don't have to express professionalism the same way that this context does it, right? I don't have to be stuffy. I don't have to keep such strong barriers to my personhood and the other, and I can find a way of being fully authentic in this space and still be professional. I can wear my head wrap, I can wear a sweater, I can wear my jean jacket and still be professional in these spaces. And that, I think, was also that place of coming to contact with and seeing that there are different ways of being professional and having that space. It's not always easy to continue to maintain it when you're not in context with other people that are expressing and feeling and have that shared experience, right? So even if I go back to my Black identity, right, being in Baltimore, being able to sit and fully on all of those things and freely express all the parts of me was easy because I could be there and I could go to the grocery store in my bonnet and my slippers and like ain't nobody looking at me because I'm not the only one. I'm not the only one at the store in my bonnet and my slippers. And second, I'm not the only Black woman there. I'm not the only Black person there, right?
Yeah.
And so doing that and the sense of liberation and freedom that comes in like being in a context where there's others expressing similarly, there's that sense of, like I said, liberation and like freedom to fully express that part of yourself. And then going into other contexts, right? And then wanting to hold on to that sense of liberation and freedom, but recognizing there isn't these people, this space doesn't have other people that look like me or express like me in this way. And what does it mean for me to retain that part of myself in this space, right? Like coming
Absolutely.
again, what does it now mean for me to retain the liberation that I experience while not being in proximity and space with others that look and act and express this way? And in fact, want to kind of continue to communicate what I was used to and try to put me back in some of those boxes. How do I navigate? What does that mean?
Mm-hmm. I think what you're saying makes total sense to me because, you know, having gone to grad school on the East Coast, having worked on the East Coast, it's so different. Like, let's just talk about decorum and professionalism.
Right.
Right? Like,
Right.
we had business casual was as informal as it got.
Yes.
And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, if I could just do therapy in like hoodie, jeans, and sweatshirt, like
Right.
and sneakers, that would be my dream job. I
Yes.
get to do that on the
Yes.
West Coast. It's amazing. And I was like, what? At
What
Portland
is
DBT
this?
Institute, I see teens.
Yes.
Like with quarantine, I've just
Right.
been working out in, I mean, not working out, but working in like my gym clothes, like a
Yeah.
nice t-shirt and gym shorts. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
it's fine. Nobody cares what I'm wearing on my legs.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And that freedom was not anything I could ever conceptualize while living on the East Coast.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I remember as an intern at Boston Children's, and uh, I, I don't know if you remember, but I have my holiday sweater. I have
You have an amazing holiday
my
sweater.
holiday sweater collection, obviously. That is coming soon. I'm so excited. 1 month or a little over a month. We're gonna be starting my holiday sweater season, and wearing my holiday sweaters at the children's hospital, and that was just like so much for them to handle that I was wearing my holiday sweaters. Everything else, like I was wearing slacks or dress skirts, dress shoes, collar underneath, everything, but I was wearing my awesome holiday sweaters. And there were a few supervisors that just really had a hard time me wearing that because they didn't feel like it was professional. And I was like, well, what about this? Is there a reason that I can't wear? Like, well, it's a disclosure. Well, okay, it's a disclosure that I'm celebrating holidays. I'm okay with that disclosure. It's a disclosure I'm okay with,
Right.
and they couldn't come up with a reason other than it was uncomfortable for them because it didn't look like the professional wear that they were used to. And they couldn't actually tell me not to wear it because there wasn't anything inappropriate about it. But I remember that tension and this desire to try and get me to every time there was one supervisor who wasn't my direct supervisor, she was one of the neuropsych supervisors, and every time so we're still doing this, and I'm like, yeah, all the way till New Year's. I've got one every day. She was like, oh. She thought it was just gonna be a couple, and she was surprised. But yeah, right, like the idea of what that context is, and how do again, me retaining a part of me even in this context that clearly did not like that I was doing, even though it didn't actually impact them and actually didn't impact my work. In fact, it actually built rapport with a lot of my clients, most of my clients.
Absolutely, because you're human.
Even the ones that don't celebrate Christmas still appreciated and loved my sweaters, right? Like, even those, it didn't create a barrier, it created conversation, and it created rapport. But just thinking about, again, the context and how, what does it mean for us to retain those parts of ourselves, that liberated side of ourselves, when we're in a space that doesn't express in that same way. And I think that as a segue, but I think that that's one of the things that's happening right now in particular, that we're seeing these parts of ourselves. We have these multiple identities, right? We have, we think about the addressing model, which is not extensive, right? But we have all of these identity markers, and then all of these other nuanced identity markers on top of that. And even as people who try to be super integrated and intentional about how we integrate those parts of ourselves, when there are conflicts or things that are coming up, sometimes, and again, I'm seeing this a lot in conversations that I'm having with professionals, all of a sudden they're realizing like, oh my gosh, this side of me, this part of me, my identity here is not actually in full congruence with this part of me. I'm experiencing this
Mm-hmm.
tension, whether that's like my identity as a Christian and my identity as an advocate, as a Black woman, as whatever, that all of a sudden when we might think that we're really integrated, and then tensions arise, or things that are happening in the world, or things that are happening in our life, and all of a sudden we're feeling this different level of tension because we didn't realize that we're not as integrated with our multiple identities as we thought we were, because
Mm-hmm.
these strong ideas that we had in this part of my identity is now conflicting with strong ideas, or whether that's my personal ideas or the ideas of the people that are part of this identity that also identify here, are in opposition. And what do we do with that? How do we do that resolution and resolve?
Mm-hmm. I love that you're bringing that up, because I think for many of us in 2020, with the events of, like, with the coronavirus, with George Floyd's murder, with, just a number of different events, we've had to face the discomfort.
Yeah.
We've had to just look at wow, this perception that I had, this bias, like, what am I going to do with it? And I love that in this class that you're teaching, it's not just about like, oh, let's learn like how to apply this clinically. It's like, let's figure out how to apply it to us.
Right.
Because ultimately, if I don't know who I am as a person, I am going to be so blind to biases, to thoughts, to interpretations that I may have that are absolutely going to interact and transact with the person I'm working with.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's coming into the room whether we identify it or not. Right. And that's the thing, is that if we don't do the work, if we don't do the personal work, it's going to be the elephant in the room that's like, it feels like I can't quite get around, or I can't get to you, and I don't know why. Well, it's because this thing, and we haven't identified it. We haven't brought it into this space. We haven't named it. And so we have to do that. We have to do that work, especially when there are extra levels of tension or things that are coming up in the world. We can't ignore the things that are happening, because it's impacting us or it's impacting the people that we're with. And what does that look like?
Absolutely. Like, I can only imagine that, like, what you were saying about not coming to this realization of how whitewashed expectations were with respect to your behavior, to your dress, and all this stuff. Like, without having that knowledge, I can imagine that if you were to interact with somebody else who is like a BIPOC person, like, the thoughts might come into mind, such as like, well, I don't understand why you're doing your hair like that, or like, why didn't you do your hair? Why didn't you blah, 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 blah.
Right. Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think about that all the time, that even as I've gone back and I've apologized to friends and people who I mentored, because I can remember instances where I reinforced those things. I reinforced that narrative by saying like, well, yeah, absolutely. And in order to and when you're in the system, like, this is how you do it. Like, this is how you have to do it. Well, no, we do have to, there's a sense of like understanding how the system works and figuring out how to navigate it. But that doesn't mean that you have to then internalize those things or change who you are in order to navigate it. You can understand the system and navigate it without shifting and changing who you are. There's a difference. And too often, systems message to people is that you have to, here's how the system is, this is how we do it, so you have to look like this in order to walk through it. Well, no, actually, I just need to know what it is. I need to know what the expectations are, and then I can navigate that by retaining me and fitting myself within those expectations. And that's a much more difficult thing to do, but it requires us to know and be solid in who we are too. And so, yeah, there were definitely times when I didn't recognize those internalized parts of myself, that I recapitulated them and told and advised friends and colleagues to shift and change, like, oh, here's how you need to say this, or here's, oh, they didn't actually mean that, like, da 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 da. and how much harm that I did as a woman of color, recapitulating these things on my friends, my family, the people in my life, right? And that's where that line is of why we need to do the work. And I'm actually going to kind of roll back a little bit, because I think we have a really great conversation. But even just thinking about, I didn't even start off by asking you, like, how do you understand, like, what intersectionality is? What is intersectionality? We've
Oh my
talked about
gosh.
these pieces, right? But if we kind of
Right.
like roll back and think, and saying like it's important to do this work, but like what is intersectionality, and how do you understand it?
I understand it for me to be like all these multiple identities.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about them, like, I wish I'd worn a plaid shirt because plaid is one of my favorite materials and designs. But I think intersectionality is a lot like plaid in the sense, like, here's this Chinese line that is running next to maybe a Canadian line that may be intersecting with the female line, which is intersecting with like the Christian line, which has this other, like, and so there are these points where they touch.
Yeah.
And then sometimes maybe it's not just plaid because that's like a little bit too linear and a little bit too regulated, but there are these smatterings of points where these parts of us come together.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's helpful for us to see just how do they transact, how do they interact internally, and then with other people.
Right.
So I am Chinese Canadian,
mm-hmm.
and I live here in Portland. Like, or Beaverton, right? Like, I live in the Portland area. And what I find so interesting is that a lot of people relate to me more as a Canadian than they do as somebody who's Chinese.
Mm-hmm.
And part of it is that I am white adjacent.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I speak English without an accent. I'm sure if I had like Pantene Pro V hair, like a lot of Asian women do, spoke with an accent, I might be treated differently. But people will find out that I'm Canadian, and that's the thing that they comment more on than the fact that that I'm Chinese Canadian. And so when I'm meeting new clients, when I'm meeting new people, that's actually how I've been introducing myself more. Just like, hey, this is actually really important to me. That you know that I'm Chinese Canadian.
Yeah. I think that's beautiful. I think very similarly, being biracial, right? Like being half Italian, and going back to the conversation about the foreground background piece, that my identity as a biracial woman has done this like back and forth at different points of my life of what that means. And I do tend to like identify or call myself a Black woman, partly because that's what the world sees. Like I call myself biracial, and it has meaning, and also I present as a Black woman and I walk through the world as a Black woman. But for me, it's also important, like I introduce those things, right? I bring that up, I talk about it a lot, because it is this like hidden identity, right? Like I think other Black folks might recognize or assume that I'm biracial, but that isn't necessarily what people expect or think of me immediately. And when I tell them I'm half Italian, sometimes it brings in this whole other context of like, oh, okay, yeah, you make more sense, right? Like, oh, right, like, yeah, I guess I could see that, or this is where some of those influences are. And even when I went to Italy for the first time, it was the coolest experience for me. Again, like understanding myself in different contexts. That when I went there, first of all, Italians acknowledged me as Italian first. Like they were like, you're Italiano, right? And I'm like, yes I am. Thank you. How did you know? Like this is amazing. And just like being seen, like feeling seen and connected, and then even being able to see how Italians interacted and what it looked like. And I was like, oh, I'm not weird. I'm Italian, right? Like these are my people. This is where this part of me comes in. And even the not retaining or hiding or whatever, that part of me, how much of me I was not allowing to be expressed, right? Or like
Sure.
totally holding on to and valuing and honoring that there's this part of me as being Italian that is so integral to how I move and how I relate and how I talk with my hands, right? There's so many parts of that I identify as a Black woman and I'm half Italian, right? Like there's this both and of it, and how do I kind of bring those things into the space too?
Well, what I love about what you're saying is that intersectionality and recognizing our intersections can actually facilitate belonging.
Right. Yeah, that's good.
Which is super interesting because my wife and I got into an Instagram fight with an acquaintance of one of my friends who had made the opposite argument. He's like, intersectionality actually promotes differences and creates divides. And I was like, actually, I don't think you know what you're talking about.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Like it's, if you really understood intersectionality, it's that you're looking at all the ways in which a person is a human being.
Absolutely. Right.
And it lets you connect with them.
Right. Absolutely. Well, and back to what you're talking about as how you're introducing yourself, right? That more people are connecting to that Canadian part of you, right? And that like without introducing that, bringing into this space, they might not have that opportunity, right? To connect to that part of you. And I think, I mean, even the research would support that we want to be part of the in-group, right? Like we want to, we our brains and how we are interpersonally connected. We're so interpersonally connected that we do this dance of trying to find the commonalities, right? And the intersectionality really does give us that space. Like, no, I don't know what it means to be Chinese or Chinese Canadian. I do know what it means to be a woman. I do know what it means to be a woman of color. I do know what it means to live in Beaverton in the Portland metro area as a woman of color, right? Like here are all of these these things that do overlap. And while there's going to be nuance in the experience of how you walk through that space as compared to how I walk through this space, there are some things that are so similar that we can connect on. And what does that mean? What does that look like? While also retaining and honoring the differences, right? There's the both and nature of being able to connect and say like, yes, I don't know the full experience. Again, even thinking about in the context of coronavirus, right? Like virus and the heightened like racial tensions and hate spewed at Asian Americans and what that's meant, right? I can understand the impact as a person of color from coronavirus and that it's being disproportionately hit, but I don't get the racial associations, right, with coronavirus. There's a different aspect.
Right.
But can we both
connect on oppression,
right, on these other pieces? Well, there's these other pieces that we can connect to while also being able to honor and say like your experience of coronavirus may be very different than mine, not in a comparative way or saying yours is worse than my oppression or whatever. It's not about comparative suffering. It's honoring the different experiences while also being able to connect on some of the things that are similar.
Absolutely. One of my favorite things about intersectionality and like just recognizing it is that it's a direct pushback against stereotypes.
Right.
Because stereotypes are generalizations, whereas if we are mindful to intersectionality and a person's intersectional like experiences and identities, we can actually see them more as the individual.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And again, I think there's this this term that I talk about a lot, which is dynamic sizing. And it is the concept of recognize, especially as professionals, as in mental health, right? And one of the criticisms and issues I take with a lot of the ways that we teach around diversity or multiculturalism is that we say like, here's the Asian group and this is how you work with Asians, and here's the Black group and here's how you work with Black folks, and here's the Hispanic, you know, and we say this is how you do this with this entire group of people. And sometimes it doesn't, often it does not do the individual work. And so there's the idea of dynamic sizing is being able to say like, okay, there are some things from a group standpoint that maybe we should be aware of. Maybe we should be aware of what some of these things that historically have been impacted on Asian Americans and Black Americans and Hispanics in these contexts. We need to understand the history of Native Americans in the United States, right? There are these large pieces of like, we have to have that as part of our history, our knowledge of a group of people. And what does this mean for you? How much does this impact you? How much do you connect with these things, right? And how much of this comes in and impacts you as the person across from me who identifies as Asian, as Chinese Canadian? Do you connect with this particular stereotype or group dynamic, or is that not something that impacts you or comes into your frame at all, right? So there's this both and nature of saying like, I can have this base of knowledge. The example I always give is like, if we don't at least have some of that and honor like some of the group experiences and understanding, and you come into a room with a Black identifying person and you just use the N word, it may not be like a great idea, right?
Therapy's probably not going to go well.
Right, it's probably not going to go well. It may be fine. It may be fine. It might not bother this person, but there's also this need to like have a sense of the group understanding or group history, and then understand how this person across from me connects within each part of those things. What does this look like in your life? What is the meaning for you? What parts of this do you even identify with this part of your identity? If I'm looking at you and I'm seeing an Asian person, but you don't call yourself Asian, okay, you don't identify with that part of your identity. What does that mean for you to walk through the world who, you know, typically looks Asian, but does not identify as Asian? What does that mean for you, right? Like, both in.
I'm glad that you brought that up, because I had a client who, and we had that interaction because this individual was adopted from China.
Right.
And so when I asked them about like, hey, so, well, you know, I'm noticing that you're adopted and looks like you're ethnically Chinese, like, what does that mean to you? And they're like, nothing.
Yeah.
And I was like, okay. Like, so I'm then starting to formulate like some ideas around, okay, it's not like I'm going to try and push a Chinese identity on them. Like, you need to like really understand your heritage and how that impacts you. But it also helps me to see like how when they're presenting in public with their adopted family, like everybody else looks really similar and they don't.
Right.
And yet, you know, they may or may not be noticing some of the differences in which, like with respect to how they're being treated.
Right. Or even their sense of belonging, right? Like even if there's no connection to what they look like or anything else, is there that sense of, you know, does it have any kind of implications to their sense of belonging, right? Because even if they're not attributing maybe subtle nuances and differences in how they're treated, they might be experiencing and feeling that, and maybe not attributing it to, you know, their phenotypic difference or their ethnic differences, but that visceral internal sense of belonging may be right?
Absolutely. It's like what you were talking about being in Baltimore.
Right.
Like a few months ago at the beginning of this year, I'd met another psychologist who was also Chinese Canadian. And we were like, boom, instant friends. Like, and it was so interesting because Resma Menachem talks about this, right? Like with respect to, you know, just being embodied in our cultural identities. Like he talks about being bodies of culture instead of like bodies of color.
Right.
And just what I noticed in being with my friend Shirley when we had dinner with her and her husband was just like,
Yes.
Like I saw things in their environment that I grew up with,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
how they did things that were very similar. It was just so familiar.
Yeah.
And I was
Yeah.
like, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
this feels like home.
Yes. Yeah. And you had that big sigh, right? That big breath. Right.
Totally.
That experience of for me was like, oh my gosh, I was holding my breath. I didn't know I was holding my breath.
Totally.
Yeah. I didn't realize, oh, wow, how long have I been holding my breath? I had no idea. Right. And so you're
Mm-hmm.
in that. And I love the idea of like bodies of culture and not, rather than bodies of color. Because the others that I think about are like third culture kids and individuals, right? That grew up, in missionary families or things like that, grew up
Oh my gosh.
internationally, but
Right.
are ethnically white, right? But they speak another language. They grew up in a whole other country. And so that's their frame culturally. That's their life. This is how they understand themselves and the world. And then they come to the US for school or whatever, and all of a sudden they're in a foreign land, and yet the expectation, right? So there's that from an intersectionality piece, and what we're talking about, like with your client, there's this perception, there's all of these things that people look at and perceive and
Mm-hmm.
project onto you based on what you look like or how you move. And then they hold these expectations of you too. And so, like, I think, again, these third culture individuals who then are expected to understand all of the references of pop culture references and how all the mores of how you interact and what proximity, how close you're allowed to be with somebody, whether you kiss them on the cheek or not, or whether you hold, as a man, if you hold another man's hand, if
Mm-hmm.
what are all of those things and these expectations that are also placed on you, even though you look color wise a certain way, but culturally you're so different. And that's that second layer to the addressing model that I like to talk about, because it's not just the identification of the markers, but it's thinking about those things in context. What's the meaning for you in those identities,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even
Mm-hmm.
when I think about if I think about age, right? Like if I think about myself as a 35-year-old woman, right? Okay, here's what it means for me in context, right? Then thinking about the power and privilege that comes with each of those identities as well, right? So
Absolutely.
as 35, right? That means it's not just looking at my age in comparison to my 12-year-old patients or my 20-year-old patients, but it's saying I'm 35. From an age perspective, I have a lot of power, a lot of privilege, right? I'm kind of like at that height there. I'm young enough to get most of the references of my young patient. A lot, not my little ones. I don't always get those, but I'm like young enough, but I'm old enough to be taken seriously. But then it also means like I'm a millennial, which means has all
Mm-hmm.
of these implications from a technology perspective and all of the communication perspective. It has then there's all of these things that it means for me individually, but then there's also expectations of me from the outside, right? When you think somebody is 35 and professional, what are the expectations that people automatic, what are the assumptions that they come, right? That they're
Right.
married, that they have kids, that they have money, that they have these things. And how much do I fit what
Right.
people are expecting or assume about these things based on that identity marker, whether it's your age, your gender, sexuality, your ethnicity, your phenotype, whatever that is. It's how you connect and what it means for you, but also what other people are perceiving and looking at, and how they're interacting with you based on the assumptions that they're making because of that intersectionality, because of that
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I love what you're saying. And the thing that just came up for me is, I think for a lot of people I work with, that sometimes these intersections are recognized, and depending on what was reinforced previously, depending on their learning history, depending on so many things, like sometimes these these points of intersection may elicit feelings of shame, may
right.
elicit feelings of like sadness, guilt, whatever it may be. And so I think that's another layer to consider with respect to
Mm-hmm.
our experience of intersectionality, is just for us, what are the emotions that come up and how are we going to deal with them?
Yes. Yeah.
Right? Like there's a woman I'm in a book club, and it's an anti-racist book club that meets every other week. And one of the ladies in my group was just sharing in our first week meeting together that, because we're introducing ourselves, and she's like, well, so 3 months ago, I came across some documents in my grandmother's house. And these were documents that had the names and values of slaves. She was a slave owner.
Wow. Wow.
Right. And so she's just recognizing this and she's saying it out loud. And there's just this like,
Yeah.
you can feel it on the Zoom call because we're all doing this via Zoom. And it was just recognizing like, okay, this is a part of your heritage. You're here in this space because you recognize that this is a part of your heritage and you want things to be different.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's huge. That there are these parts of ourselves, or even thinking about that the heritage piece, right, and the intergenerational pieces that come with that, or even, you know, again, when as we move and throughout our life, that we shift and change too, right, and we grow, and that there are parts of ourselves, are parts of our identities that maybe we still hold on to or we don't anymore, right? Like even let's say, or even let's say your identity as a Christian, let's say, but the way you understand yourself as a Christian now versus the way you understood yourself as a Christian and moved through the world 10 years ago, 15 years ago, however long ago, might be vastly different, right?
Oh, it is.
And same is vastly different. It might not be for everybody, but right, like the way in which I recapitulated or walk through the world and things within that identity, and the things that I, again, or as a Black woman, right? For me, 5 years ago, well, a little bit longer than that now, but like 6 years ago, 10 years ago, the things that I recapitulated in my identity as a Black woman and the way that I do things now as a Black woman, there are things that I'm ashamed. I have shame around, right? Even within that, even in that identity. And that's why I said, like, I went back and was apologizing. Like, I didn't know better. I didn't even realize I didn't understand. And now what does it mean for me to walk with intention differently in my life? And you're right, there's a lot. And I think that in that same way, particularly right now, that sorry, my computer's dying, so I'm gonna plug it up. That I think that when we talk about power and privilege, right, that we're having a lot of conversations around not knowing what to do with that, because I've been given this thing. I didn't ask for the power and privilege, and yet I have it. And also I've struggled too. I've had things that I've struggled with too, but I have this other thing, and I'm being told I have this power and privilege, and I have shame around it, but I don't know what to do with it, right? Like, what do I do with this thing that I've been given that I didn't ask for, right? Or and I think that there's a lot of questions, and there's a lot of angst and questions on figuring out how do I resolve my life experiences with the understanding of power and privilege and things that maybe I got easy because of X, Y, and Z for me as a Black woman, but also as a highly assimilated Black woman and a Black woman who is light skinned. When I look at myself in comparison to one of my best friends, Dr. B, who is dark skinned and navigates the world from a very Afrocentric perspective, has dreads. When we're in this space together, both doctors of, she's doctor of counseling education, and I'm psychology, in that space, when we're talking about the same thing, but when I say it a little bit differently, that I am heard differently than she's heard, right? What does that mean in resolving the power and privilege that I wield, even within my identity as a Black woman, but that looks different then her identity as a Black woman and how she navigates that space, the resolving and recognizing some of the nuance, and again, some of the shame that can come from that, or the sense of guilt that come with it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Like, the thing that comes to mind in this moment is something that Layla Saad wrote about in Me and White Supremacy, which is, transferring privilege.
Mm-hmm.
Like, in those moments,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because you're aware. I can imagine that you would say, if you're having a conversation with a third party and your friend said something and then you like just reiterated it differently, but the person responds to you, I could see you saying, actually she said it first.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. Like, and that's that practice of like transferring privilege.
That's good. Yeah.
So I think it's helpful for us to be mindful too, like you were saying, all these different ways in which we may have privilege, we may have power, we may have all these advantages that somebody else doesn't have. And yet, what are we going to do with it?
Yeah. 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 How do we take the awareness of that and operationalize it in our life? What does it actually mean for us when we're interacting with others? How do we become intentional and aware of the meaning making when I'm interacting with another person, rather than allowing things to just happen or unfold? How can I actively do something that is an acknowledgement of my intersecting identities as well as your intersecting identities in those spaces?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Like, Leticia Nieto talks about rank, and she has 3 different levels. There's rank there, and I'm trying to remember the other 2, which are escaping me right now. But one of them is like temporal, and the other is not. Right. So being aware of in interactions with another person, like if I, as somebody who's like highly educated, right? Like, people with doctorates are in like the top, what is it, 1 or 2%,
right,
when it comes to education.
right,
Like, certainly in that instance, I definitely have more power than this other individual who may not.
right,
However, if that person is a white male,
right,
like,
right,
that's another thing to factor in, because as a Chinese Canadian female, I don't have
right,
the same
right.
rank.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I was talking about that the other day as I was just kind of reflecting on the Breonna Taylor verdict, right? And thinking about the composite of the meaning of that, and not from a political standpoint or anything, rather than recognizing, like, okay, if we say that the actions were within their right as police officers, which clearly, according to the law, it was. But what does that mean for somebody that looks like me? What does that mean for me, right? And regardless of what I do, right? My what's happening, my commitment to my faith, my commitment to my students, my commitment to my field, my guild, my commitment to my community. And it happened to be a day that it was like raining outside, and I was gearing up for my run. Well, not run. Let's be real. I don't run. I walk. My walk. And I have my hoodie on, and I don't normally wear a hoodie, but I had a hoodie on and I had it up, and I had a hat on and I had my mask on, and I just caught this glimpse of myself, right? And I saw myself in the mirror, and I was like, like, and I'm a big girl too. And then all of these thoughts started going through my head, right? Like, is my stature as I go, first of all, am I going to be safe leaving my house, going on my walk?
Right.
Thinking about Ahmaud Arbery. Is my stature going to be something that's seen as threatening, like Eric Gardner? Or is, my choice to wear a hoodie going to be seen as suspicious, like Trayvon Martin? Or my choice to wear a mask to protect myself or somebody else going to be seen as a problem, like Elijah McClain. And if something were to happen, and the quote unquote unthinkable, which clearly is not unthinkable, were to happen, the end of the day, what does that mean for me? What's the for me? And all of these things of what I do, my rank, right? Like as a professional, as somebody who's highly educated, as somebody who's really committed and tries to make a difference in the world and the people around me. What is, when it comes down to it, what does it mean, right? And how is that going to be seen, viewed from the world, through the justice system, through those things? Are those things going to be meaningful? Are those things going to be something that are viewed and validated as something that is justifiable to honor and recognize, right? And thinking about that meaning as like, yeah, I mean, I'm a really friendly person. Like, I'm a friendly person. And like, even when I have my mask on, like I smile with my eyes, like I think most people can see it. Like, I'm highly expressive. So the mask doesn't really take away a whole lot. Right?
You smize all the time.
It's true. Like, you could mostly tell, but it was this sense, and I had my hat on though too, so it kind of hooded my face, and but there's those things, right? Like, these parts of me, even though I have quote unquote, I have a lot of power and privilege in all of these areas of my life, and also the meaning in the world around me, how does that, how do those things fit, right, in context?
Totally.
In those times and in those moments, in certain situations, in certain contexts, like that ranking, that flip of, even though I hold and yield all of this power and privilege as a highly educated Black, light-skinned Black woman in academics, who has, pedigree and has been trained at places that have a fancy name and have all of these things, and cool, right? Like, I have all of this power and privilege and access to money and all of these things, and this other part of me, in certain contexts, those things don't come into play. And so
they're not recognized, right? Like, you're not going to go running and wear a sign that says professor at George Fox,
right,
Christian,
right,
blah, blah, blah,
right,
like, while you're out for your walk.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And it's those times when, again, that foreground background, where one part of your identity becomes the most salient thing in a context. And again, the recognition of what that means for me, right? And I remember when I was little, one of the biggest things, she could have done this a little bit more gently, but one of the biggest things that my mom taught us when my brother and I were growing up, and my mom's Italian, and she would just, and I would say, like, well, what am I? What do I call myself? I get that question all the time. What are you? And right. And she would say, baby girl, you can call yourself whatever. You can identify however you want to, but you need to know that the world is going to see you as a Black woman. And there was something really, it was really important to me as a biracial person to be able to connect with, I can connect with my identity as a biracial person, and also acknowledge that as I walk through the world, people are not going to say, well, she's half white, so I need to treat her differently. I have to also acknowledge that there are certain contexts and certain situations that my identity and being perceived as a Black woman is going to be the most salient identity marker in the space. And that's going to have implications for the ways in which I navigate the interaction. And I have to be aware of that, because if I don't understand and recognize that, then I'm going to be navigating things in a way that could put me at harm, or somebody else in harm's way, because I'm not recognizing how I'm being perceived, right? Because I'm not walking around with I'm biracial, I'm half white. like marker on my
psychologist,
so
BT
I'm a
dubs.
psychologist, I'm this, right? I don't have these placards that I can just wear. And so I have to be aware. We all have to be aware, right? Of what identity marker from a perception perspective too is going to be most salient when you're in certain contexts and situations. Not that all of those things and the composite of who you are isn't important. It is. And that foreground background, understanding what it looks like and how you navigate, how you bring all of those things into that moment, but recognizing what's the thing that the other person is filtering this interaction through first.
Oh, totally. And also to recognize for people of majority culture that sometimes they get to put forth what they want to put forth.
Right.
Like my wife doesn't lead with, hey, I am a white woman born in Colorado.
Right.
Right. She leads with her name.
Right.
She leads with like, I'm a psychologist, blah, blah, blah. And I just feel like I have to check off so many boxes sometimes.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. Just being able to put that, even the need to put those things into the space, like you said, right? In order for one to expand the lenses that they're looking at, that they're interacting with you with, right? So if the Canadian part of you is the part that they're connecting to first, right? Without bringing that into this space, how long does it take for them to get to connect to you? So there is that sense of especially when there's phenotypic or obvious quote unquote differences, the things that we have to intentionally bring into the space to say like, okay, I do have all of these intersectional identities and they're invisible. So let me make them visible, right?
Right.
And talk about like the invisible knapsack. Let's Peggy, oh gosh, the last name is off my brain right now. But which is an old article, right, on like what's as a person who as a white woman, she was writing Macintosh. As a white woman, what are all of the privileges and things that I hold that I get to do on a day-to-day basis without thinking about? And here are all of these things, unpacking this invisible knapsack. And there's a recent article out too about how people of color, BIPOC folks, right now are also unpacking their invisible knapsack of like, what are the things that we have to do in order to navigate the world around us that other people don't see? And that being one of them. Like, let me put these things out here. Like, so one of the things I put out there a lot is I grew up in rural Oregon, right? Like, yet bring this part of like, I'm from Oregon, but I grew up in a rural space. So I know what it means to like be country. I grew up around like people in a country space, like understand that. Like, so maybe you'll connect with this part of me, and maybe you'll connect with me being half Italian, and maybe you'll connect with, I lived on the East Coast for a little while, and maybe you'll connect with these other pieces rather than just seeing me through the one obvious lens that you see, right? And the invisible kind of extra labor that we do about having to make visible the invisible of our intersecting identities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So there's this kind of funny story. Now looking back on it, it is really funny. So I was traveling one time and my wife came with me to the Portland International Airport. And it just so happened that I was in the lane that was right next to the barrier. So we could hold hands because we were super cheesy like that, walking up until the final moment. And so I was dressed in a hoodie and I had a ball cap on and like a jacket and my backpack. And the security guard comes rushing over. He's like, 6 feet tall or something like that. He's gigantic. I'm only 4'11". So he's like way taller than me. He comes running over and he looks at my wife and he says, "Do you want to come in so you can walk through security with your special needs son?" And we're both like,
what?
It was early in the morning. I get it. It was like 7 o'clock in the morning, but we both looked at each other and my wife goes, "You mean my wife?" And the guy just turns beet red and like backs away and just like disappears. And I did not see him in the security area after that. But it was super interesting how, you know, we're talking about intersectionality. And then there are these identities that I don't even
like, I've never been perceived as a special needs son before.
No.
Wow.
No.
Wow.
Super interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, like I get that with my hair being short
Yeah,
and it misgendered, and since I had my bilateral mastectomy last year because of breast cancer, like I didn't get reconstruction because I was like, screw that, I'm never wearing a bra again, so why?
yeah.
Like
I don't blame you. I don't blame you.
if I have to have like body parts removed, then I'm going to reap the benefits of not having
That's the
to ever
benefit.
wear
Yeah.
anything to support them again. And so, you know, people will look at me, and I remember there was this other time where we went to the restroom out in Tillamook with my wife and another friend of mine and another friend of ours, and I walk into the ladies' room once again wearing a hoodie and a ball cap because it's like a Saturday and it's raining and we were doing an outdoor thing, right? Like,
yes.
and this lady looks at me and she says, "This is the ladies' restroom." And I looked at her and I just said, "Lesbian with breast cancer." And then I went right into this doll, turn around, and I just see her, and she has this look of like shame and shock and like anger and embarrassment, and then she leaves, and I was like, serves you right.
Yeah. Yeah. Seriously. Wow. Well, not
So,
and going to intersectional identities too, around even your connection and identity with being a cancer survivor, right? And being a double having a double mastectomy, and how that shifts again exactly what you're talking about, maybe even shifts the way you're perceived in the world, right? Like, and this part of you that has maybe not been a part of your frame of understanding and being misgendered in that way before, and now is like, okay, I'm integrating this new part of me that it is not, I'm dealing with my own internal stuff around really getting to know my body and things like that. But with that, this also is shifting the external perceptions of even my gender identity, my gender presentation to the world. And
absolutely.
What does it mean for me to like navigate those things too?
Exactly. So those were like two other layers of intersectionality.
Yeah. My God.
I had not really anticipated until it started happening to me. I was like,
oh,
okay. Yeah. Like,
yeah,
let me approach this instead of distancing myself from it.
right. Yeah. And the meaning making of that, like, so apparently this is a thing now, so how am I going to interact with that? What do I do with this when it comes up, right?
I mean, how do I show up for myself in the midst of it?
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. Like, not embracing somebody else's discomfort,
right,
and internalizing it as shame,
right.
And that's why, like, I think my response, lesbian with breast cancer, is like, I had to rehearse it for like a while, for a few weeks, because I was anticipating that this moment would happen. In DBT, we call that coping ahead, where you're kind of anticipating and you figure out what skills you're going to use. So I like practiced my tone of voice. I practiced how I was going to say it. I practiced it being like quippy and like delivering it with a smile, you know, like, lesbian with breast cancer.
Yeah.
You know, so, and I think for me, just recognizing, okay, other people are going to have very different perceptions of me than I know myself to be. So what are the ways in which I can honor this part of me as a breast cancer survivor thriver?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's so important, the honoring of your identities, because I think what happens, or what's easy to do, is to be dismissive of it, right? Or to be apologetic of it. Like, oh, I'm sorry. No, it's no, actually I am. Like, I am a woman, like, and like feeling like apologetic or dismissing this, or feeling like you have to be pulled to do something in that moment, when really you were the victim in that.
Totally.
Case,
like,
right? I think the assault on your personhood and your identities, And yet our pull is for us to be the one to be dismissive of ourself and apologetic for this piece of us, right? So how do we honor and kind of reclaim that identity without taking on the need to cater to the person who just harmed us?
Absolutely. I'm a former people pleaser.
Right.
And, as a former people pleaser, we acquire behaviors, a lot of apologies and whatnot, so that we can make other people feel comfortable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, not doing that anymore.
Yeah.
Right? Like, if somebody is uncomfortable with me going to the bathroom because they're not sure what gender I am, guess what? I know what gender I am. And if you aren't sure that you're in the right restroom, that's not my problem.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I'm a recovering people pleaser. I'm not recovered. I catch it every so often. Like, oh, I didn't need to do that. No, that wasn't me. That was them. I didn't need to apologize for this, or the amount. And I think that, again, with certain of my identities being at the foreground most of my life, that I learned certain verbal gymnastics to do to make and cater to the other. And so there's the people pleaser, and then there's these identity things, that other pieces of the identity that have been reinforced that I felt like I had to cater to making the other person feel comfortable. I'm working on that. Catch it every so often, but I think this has been amazing, and we could talk about this all day.
I
want to respect your time, but I think that just as we're kind of finishing up, I wonder if you were, talking to like my class or talking to somebody about exploring and what it means to explore your intersectional identities, how would you suggest kind of starting that process and thinking through kind of your own intersectional identities, or maybe what was that like, or what has that process been like for you?
I tend to be a pretty visual person. And so, just in thinking about like the back of the Starbucks mug that has all the little boxes on it, right? Like, I think it's helpful just to even start out there. Yeah. Right? Whether you use the addressing model, whether you just start out by like, okay, let me just, start from the top of my head and move down, and then also like start to go inwards in terms of layers, whether it is, you're adding layers of education to that, or even where you've lived geographically. I love visual representation, and I think the thing that is super fun is to make a collage. Like,
I love that. Yeah.
Right. So like, we're all academics. We write so many freaking papers, and don't do something like that is cerebral. Because I think really coming to terms with our intersectional identities requires some depth work that we can't just think through. We have to feel through.
Absolutely. I love that. I'm super excited, because I think that's what we're gonna do.
Oh my gosh, everybody's gonna make a collage.
I love it. Because normally we do a journal, kind of
through the journal.
We're gonna do a collage. I love that. I think that's fantastic, and I think such a great way for people to start to explore those parts of themselves and represent it in some way. And collage. I love it. Thank you.
And for sure, I kind of want to make a new one.
I mean, I kind of want to make one too. I think I am. Maybe before class, I'll make one and I'll share my collage with them, and then they can go and make their own. I think I might have to do that. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, great. Such a great idea. And I'm so glad you're doing this in grad school.
I love it. Yeah, man, I'm just so thankful. Thank you so much for this conversation, for this time. It's meaningful. It was meaningful for me.
Oh my gosh, for me too.
And I hope, I know that it will be meaningful for my students. And so, and I'm so excited for the collage. And I think every time we talk, I always leave with new nuggets of wisdom and new insights. And I'm just so thankful for you. So thank you for giving of your time, chatting with me today, and sharing of yourself with my students, even though you haven't met them, but they're all fantastic and wonderful. And I'm sure someday you'll get a chance to interact with some of them. So
I would love that.
yeah. Thank you so
I would
much.
love that. Thank you for this time. It's been lovely. And this is the thing that I love about you and I love about our interactions. It's that, here we're modeling two professionals being very personal and personable. And guess what? I don't think we've lost any professionalism.
Right. Yeah. Agreed. And I talk about that all the time, right? Like that I try to be really intentional about allowing my students to see me, all of me, right? Like being able to see me as a as a whole person, because it's important to see that you can be fully authentic and be professional and be good at what you do. And that can look different for different people, but there's lots of ways to embody being a professional in your space. And you can be personal and professional and personable all in one. And man, I just love that we got a chance to do that and show that to my students. So
oh my gosh, Amber, I see a podcast in your future.
I'm not gonna lie, I've thought about it a few times. I have a number of friends that have podcasts recently, and I'm like, I want to be on a podcast, or I'll talk to them about their podcast, and they're like, you should have done this episode. I'm like, I'm just giving you a summary of what you talked about.
Oh my gosh, I think you could totally do a podcast on this topic.
I might have to consider that.
The personable professional.
Ooh, the personable professional. I like it. I might have to.
I'm just gonna plant the seed.
Okay. Might have to do another interview sometime in the future. Perfect. Well,
awesome.
Thank you. I'm gonna end our recording, but thank you so much. Thank you so much, Erica. If any of the students have questions or want to talk to you about anything, would you be willing for me to share your email information?
Yes, I'm going to put it in the chat right now.
Perfect.
They can reach me at my work email.
Excellent. There might be some questions or people that would like to continue talking with you. Which makes sense because you're amazing. So.
Oh, I just super duper love what I get to do.
Perfect. And I will have that ready and available in case anybody would like to reach out to you. So
okay, sounds good.
Thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and end here.
All right.